Next up, we are addressing the topic, what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine. Does IP matter? Please welcome Deputy Director Laura Peter, Congressman Scott Perry, and Tom McClintock, moderated by Dan Schneider.
Thank you all. Well, intellectual property is something we always address at CPAC. When we started doing this 6 years ago, lots of people didn't understand the significance of it, but I think Donald Trump has helped people understand why it's so critical. He has put such an exclamation point on the fact that the communist Chinese government, is stealing our intellectual property. But all left-wing sorts of organizations and governments are doing the same thing. In Virginia, the legislature, now controlled by the hard left, is trying to make gun ownership illegal, but also trying to confiscate people's firearms without due process of law or just compensation. Now, a firearm is not intellectual property, it's personal property. But the principle is the same. If you create something with your mind or your hands, it is rightfully yours. Now, I've got three extraordinary individuals here with me tonight. We've got Congressman McClintock from California, Congressman Perry from Texas, a Brigadier General, Pennsylvania. I'm sorry.
That's the other Perry.
And Director of the Patent and Trademark Office, Laura Peters. Laura, intellectual property. You have an incredible background in the private sector. Why does intellectual property matter?
So we just heard Ivanka Trump in the last session talk about the importance of property and that in over 70 countries around the world, women are not allowed to hold property. Well, that's half the population, and intellectual property is a key right and very much akin to real property, and it powers growth in jobs, in the economy, and it keeps our United States of America competitive in the global market. I have a couple of statistics for you that intellectual property-rich industries support 45.5 million jobs in the United States. The share of total United States GDP for IP-intensive industries is 40%. And people in these industries earn an average wage of more than 46% more than in other industries. So you just see the power of intellectual property, that it helps create jobs, it helps create a better life for people, and it helps power the American economy in this incredibly global and competitive world.
Tom McClintock is one of those members of Congress I love meeting with, because he can start quoting chapter and verse of Locke's second treatise. And we were backstage trying to remember the famous Lincoln quote. And not only did Tom McClintock know the quote, he actually knew the speech that it came from. What did Lincoln have to say about intellectual property?
Oh, he was a very strong proponent of it. And it flows from our belief as conservatives that you have a right to the fruit of your own labor. That was the central core of Lincoln's entire philosophy. And it's not just the right to your physical labor, it's also a right to your intellectual labor. And that's what intellectual property rights are all about. But it's a bit of a paradox for conservatives, because on the one hand, we fervently believe in that right to the fruit of your intellectual labor, but on the other hand, we don't like it when government grants monopoly charters that prevent competition. And that was the struggle that the founders had at the Constitutional Convention. Now, this was not debated much at the time. In fact, there's no record of debate on the Patents Clause in the Constitutional Convention. Madison devoted one paragraph to it in the Federalist, and he basically says, well, the English have found this helpful.
Congressman,
But the point I was going to make, though, is that I think the founders got it right. They split the difference. They said, yes, there needs to be protection for people's intellectual property, but it can't go on indefinitely without gumming up the economy. So the principles in the Constitution are there's a limit to the amount of time, and it is for a specific purpose, for the promotion of the science and the arts.
I have a trick question. How many times are rights addressed in the Constitution? Congressman McClintock probably knows the answer.
I don't.
One time. When we talk about constitutional rights, we're generally referring to the Bill of Rights. But it's only in the Constitution one time where authors and inventors have, well, of course we have.
Indeed.
Yeah, so the director of the Patent and Trademark Office.
This is my favorite part of the Constitution, in that it says in the Constitution that only authors and inventors have the right to their inventions and their works in order to progress the science and the useful arts. And this is the only individual right addressed in the Constitution. And it's fundamental to everything we do today and fundamental for our need for a stable and reliable intellectual property system.
That's right. And of course, our founders did understand it should be limited. So a patent life is 17 years.
And conservatives ever since have adopted that same philosophy. Ayn Rand, who was a very, very fervent supporter of intellectual property rights, also recognized it can't go on indefinitely, otherwise you gum up the entire system.
Right.
And you can't diffuse knowledge freely, which is absolutely essential in a society like ours.
So Congressman Scott, Brigadier General Scott, the Chinese understand the value of patents.
They sure do.
They don't like to pay for the research and development. Instead, they do other things.
They'll pay when they have to, but they will use any means necessary. And I think fundamental to the conversation is that everybody has to understand under a socialist system, and in their case, a communist system. And just for the point of that is, to me, socialism is an economic construct. And when the people inherently reject it, then communism enforces it. But they don't have individual property rights. And one of the great things about America and the free world is the individual property rights is what spurs on the innovation, the competition, the drive to do better and have more for yourself and your family. They don't have that in China. It's a communist system. And so how are they going to get the innovation if it's not going to be inherent to their country? They're going to steal it from your country, our country, which is what they're doing. I'll just give you one example. We spent about $40 billion developing the C-17 aircraft for the Air Force. It's the major transport aircraft that gets our power projection, our forces overseas. They spent about $400,000 stealing the plans for it, and now they have their version at a very small amount of time and investment financially.
What was the value of that investment?
Well, it's $40 billion.
$40 billion.
For the development, or $202 million a copy.
Who spent the $40 billion?
We all did. The taxpayers did.
That's our intellectual property.
That's our intellectual property.
And the Chinese Communist government stole it.
They took it, along with the F-22, the F-35. They stole our railgun, hypersonic weapons. I mean, the list just goes $300 to $600 billion. $300 to $600 billion annually stolen from the United States from China, by China.
Now, I've got my phone here. It was a couple of years ago. I was on this very stage, and my mom called me, and I forgot to turn off my ringer. But the number of patents in a smartphone is really extraordinary. And it sure is a whole lot easier to just steal the technology, build the phone, and sell it. And then for consumers, it's a whole lot cheaper just to buy a pirated thing. But if we continue to do that sort of thing, what happens to innovation? Maybe this is a question for the director.
Well, indeed. So the whole goal of the patent system is to give exclusive rights to inventors so they can reap the rewards of their invention and give them that period of time where they actually can recoup their investment. So you're incentivizing investment. You're allowing investors in the inventors, in the technology, to recoup their investment. And then you're also teaching the community, you're donating that science and technology to the rest of America so they can build off of your idea when that patent term expires. So it's a wonderful evolutionary system.
I was going to say, Thomas Jefferson, your predecessor, when he was Secretary of State, he was the head of the member at the time, a three-member patent board, wrote a really insightful letter in 1813 where he says, you know, an idea is kind of like it's different than physical property. You can't put a lock on it. You can't put a fence around it. So it's obviously a creature of the law. It's not a natural right, but it stems from a natural right. And his point was that if I have a candle, you light your candle from mine, it doesn't diminish my candle in the slightest. So it's a very different sort of thing. And he was concerned about two things. Number one, to protect that right, but also to protect the diffusion of knowledge through the society. And that was the central point of his looking at our intellectual property rights. And one other just interesting point, I thought, all the complaints we have about China, the English used to have against us. In the 19th century, we had a patent system for the United States, but we did not particularly recognize the copyrights and patents in Britain. Charles Dickens comes here in the mid-19th century and says, my works are everywhere and I'm not getting a penny for it. So ultimately, it was the end of the 19th century when you started having international conventions where nations agreed to respect each other's property rights. And obviously, we have a lot of work to do with China.
China does not respect our property rights, intellectual or otherwise. Like I said, if they can't get it through some kind of a collateral agreement with a business where they do the research and development and then essentially just take it from them, one way or the other, they've decided, and they've got a plan, China 2025, where they were going to acquire a certain amount of items that they deem necessary to be the dominant force in the world. And when I say dominant, that means they're going to surpass the United States, and they intend to. And if you think you're immune to it, whether you work in agriculture, whether you work in transit, whether you work in information technology, you name it, it is on the list of items that they wish to acquire one way or the other.
Right.
Well, and I think this is why we need to keep on moving forward and keep our technological leadership in America. The more we can do to encourage young people to go into the sciences and technology, to expand the innovation ecosphere to include more women, more minorities, more people from low-income families, the more we can pour into the system and keep our technological edge. And I have to say that's something this administration has supported greatly, and we've been working very hard to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, Huawei is a company that just a few years ago nobody in America had heard of, but now it's becoming better understood, better known. Huawei has all of, they're trying to embed their technology in different communication systems all over the world, and we're trying to encourage foreign governments, our allies, not to do it because it provides an avenue for additional theft and espionage. Is there a way to leapfrog the Huawei system?
To go beyond 5G?
I've been reading about virtualized networks where, if we're going to roll out 5G, we can leapfrog by going beyond just their architecture.
I think the circumstance might be that 5G is the next step, and while we're working on 6G, we won't get there before the Chinese if we allow Huawei to be the conductor of the information, because they're simply going to steal whatever we have before we have it. And in military terms, they have another way of describing that, and they call it left of launch. So the theory would be that they would launch missiles against the United States, or the United States would launch missiles against China. They're going to have the information about our decision-making process, and if you look at a timeline that goes from this side to this side, they will interdict that to the left. So they will stop whatever we're thinking about's happening. If we might have the best aircraft carrier, the best aircraft, the best everything, it's never going to make it to the battle space because they're going to interdict it and stop it left of launch. And they would do the same thing with 6G, which is why they cannot be allowed to be the purveyors of 5G.
Ideas, though, are very different than physical things. An idea, you cannot protect an idea. And Jefferson made this point in this letter that you own your idea until you divulge it. And the moment you divulge it, everybody knows about it. So the only way to protect it is through the law. or through the trade agreements that we negotiate, but and it has to be in the mutual interest of the societies. And that's where I think that Donald Trump is absolutely right in the line that he has taken on the trade agreements with China. There has to be a mutual benefit.
I agree with you completely, Tom.
The sanctity of the intellectual property that's developed in both countries.
The question is what do you do when you're dealing with a partner, so to speak, or whoever else you're dealing with, where your intellectual property or otherwise, who refuses to acknowledge or abide by the law? The Chinese lie and cheat. They always have, and as far as we know, unless something changes dramatically, they always will. So we have to, what we do has to have that viewpoint in mind.
And therein lies the difficulty with what we're dealing with today.
Right.
Well, let me ask you this, because what a patent is determined by legislation, Supreme Court decision. So there is something that we can do. We can better define what a patent is. Combination drugs, that's an issue. Director, what do we do? What's the right approach there?
So for the United States Patent and Trademark Office, we are there to implement the laws. We do not write the laws. That's to these good gentlemen on my right and the rest of Congress to do that. What we have tried to do in the United States Patent and Trademark Office is to bring more clarity in how we implement the law. There was a whole patchwork of Supreme Court cases on what you could patent and what you couldn't patent. We at the Patent Office tried to create some guidelines to bring more clarity to that, bring more transparency to the process, so that there can be more of an expectation by patent applicants on what they're going to get. And with that, we hope that will continue to incentivize people to invest in their technology and get more patents.
But I still think, and I agree, Laura here, that they implement the laws, but we have to make the laws, and we have to understand and recognize and acknowledge what we're dealing with. We've been told that for 30 or 40 years by our government that China is a strategic competitor. I got news for you, ladies and gentlemen. They view us as the enemy, and they're coming to take our stuff and take us over if they can. And so from my standpoint, at a minimum, there ought to be reciprocity. When I say that, what I mean is if China doesn't allow our students to go study and develop things in China, then why in the heck are we allowing their students to come and develop things in our country instead?
That's exactly the answer. Mutual self-interest. We cannot make laws that China is going to respect. We can create agreements where it's in the mutual interest of both countries to respect.
Well, I will say that the U.S.-China trade deal that was just signed this last month or so ago has taken first good steps in that direction to bring more equality and balance into the relationship, especially when it comes to pro-patent laws.
Once again, it will take eternal vigilance. As we know, the Chinese told us that the ship they bought from Ukraine was just a ship that they were going to use for domestic purposes, and they turned it into an aircraft carrier. They told us that the islands they were building, in the Senkaku Islands off the coast there, they told us that they had no military purpose, and then they militarized them. Unfortunately, China is not a reliable actor in this regard and cannot be trusted, and so we have to comport our policies with that in mind, because that is simply the reality of the fact, and I think it's going to take some time for Americans to realize that they are not just a strategic competitor. They have something very different in mind for us, and so we can't. What's even worse about this is that with their involvement, where once again reciprocity is not available, they get to participate in our financial markets, but we don't get to participate in theirs. So literally, this is not allowing the Trojan horse in. This is us building the Trojan horse for them to bring in. This is absurd.
The Congressman, you said that the Chinese are not truthful about things. The Chinese Communist Party also claims that the Tiananmen Square massacre didn't take place.
Right.
I was there. It happened. I saw the tanks rolling in. I saw the guns being pulled out. The Chinese Communist Party, like every socialist regime that has ever existed, does terrible things. They're thuggish. They try to dehumanize and destroy. I know we don't have much time, and that I just left a sour note there. But what's hope? What's the hope here? How do we use our laws and our system of government to promote humanity and a strong economy.
Well, the hope is and it's the reality, that our respect for property rights, our patent system in the United States has provided the fertile ground for the most innovative society in the history of civilization, and a beacon to the world, an example to the world, as long as we stand by these principles. As you pointed out, these principles are now under unprecedented attack from the left, and that's going to be the defining issue of our age, whether we restore those principles, enforce those principles, or whether we lose them to socialism.
I think the hope has to be that while we remain the beacon that Tom has just described, and we absolutely must, we also have to use the full might, diplomatic, economic, military, as necessary to be the hammer and the anvil that brings the Chinese Communist Party to its knees.
And I would say that we have some of the most talented and great scientists and innovators in the world, and we need to respect their intellectual property, respect their property rights, not take things without due process of law, and encourage people to keep on feeding into that system so we can continue our global leadership in technology.
3 great leaders, 3 great patriots. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think we're going that way.
Thank you.